In order to understand Operation Torch, we must first look at the events following the fall of France in June 1940. In July, the Armistice of Compiègne was signed, and a new constitution created the state commonly known as Vichy France. France's overseas empire remained intact, as well as her navy, now her most powerful military asset. The military commander-in-chief was Amiral de la Flotte Jean-François Darlan. Darlan, whose great-grandfather died at the Battle of Trafalgar, was a staunch Anglophobe. After France's defeat, Darlan made promises to the British that the French capital ships would not fall into German hands. However, the terms of the armistice called for the demobilization and disarmament of the ships of the French Navy under German supervision. Thus, Darlan ordered all ships to steam for French overseas possessions. In February 1941, Darlan became vice president of the council and was appointed to a number of other ministry positions. Darlan repeatedly refused British requests to place the whole French fleet in British custody, and in attempts to get the British to release French warships, he gave a version of the armistice terms inconsistent with what the British knew from other sources to be the case. This caused Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, to become distrustful of Darlan. Concerned that Darlan would not or could not deliver on his promises, the British launched an attack on a part of the French fleet at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria, codenamed Operation Catapult. Thereafter, French forces loyal to Vichy fiercely resisted British moves into French territory and sometimes cooperated with German forces. Darlan expected Germany to win the war and saw it as to France's advantage to collaborate with Germany. He now distrusted the British and severed political relations with them. However, the United States did not sever relations with Vichy France. Instead, a diplomat named Robert Murphy was sent to Algiers to negotiate an economic assistance program to French North Africa. Murphy's foot had been crushed in an elevator accident, keeping him out of World War I, and allowing him to study law and join the diplomatic corps. Following the fall of France, Murphy was assigned to the Vichy government, but secretly arranged to smuggle 2,000 tons of gold from the Bank of France to Dakar. For months, he shuttled between Washington and London disguised as a lieutenant colonel, because as George Marshall said, quote, "Nobody ever pays attention to a lieutenant colonel," end quote. In February 1941, the Murphy-Wagon Trade Accord was signed, which allowed America to export to French North Africa despite the British blockade. However, Murphy also had more covert dealings in North Africa. He was the head of an espionage network codenamed the 12 Apostles, a dozen American vice consuls who technically served as food control officers. Although they collected useful information about ports, beaches, and coastal defenses, they were hardly professional spies. One had been a Coca-Cola salesman in Mississippi, and another one was described as an ornament of Harry's bar in Paris. German intelligence operatives were not slow in identifying these novices, reporting to Berlin that, quote, "all their thoughts are centered on their social, sexual, and culinary interests." American President Franklin Roosevelt had been watching the developments of the war in Europe closely and was concerned with the fall of France. With Britain's future on the brink and German influence spreading to South America, it seemed possible that an unprepared America would soon have to provide its own first line of defense. Only 1,600 miles of ocean separated Dakar in Vichy-administered French West Africa from Brazil. In a radio address, Roosevelt warned the American people about the danger they faced from the Germans. "They have the armed power at any moment to occupy Spain and Portugal, and that threat extends not only to French North Africa and to the western end of the Mediterranean, but also to the Atlantic fortress of Dakar and to the island outposts of the New World, the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands. The Cape Verde Islands are only 7 hours distant from Brazil by bomber or troop-carrying planes. They dominate shipping routes to and from the South Atlantic. The war is approaching the brink of the Western Hemisphere itself. It's coming very close to home." With the attack on Pearl Harbor still more than a year off, no one paid much attention to this warning. However, the British and American militaries had secretly been planning grand strategy against the Axis throughout 1941. Although much of the American public wanted to remain neutral, the Lend-Lease Act was signed in March 1941. This provided economic and military assistance to allied factions like the de Gaulle-led Free France, but not to the Vichy regime. The situation for the Allies in the Mediterranean was dire. In the spring of 1941, Malta was being bombed regularly, Rommel was driving eastward toward the Suez Canal, and German paratroopers had taken the island of Crete. If the Mediterranean became an Axis lake and the British lost their possessions in the Middle East, then they might not be able to continue resisting Hitler. The course of the war changed irrevocably in June of 1941 with the German invasion of the Soviet Union. For the Mediterranean theater, it became a backwater for the Axis, with limited shipments of troops and material now available. Rommel's attacks would stall, and the British would counterattack during Operation Crusader in November. In April 1941, the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact was signed, causing the Japanese leaders to turn south. This represented the end of over 100 years of rapid transformation. Until the late 1800s, Japan had been a nation with ancient political traditions and little contact with the Western world. Visits by Commodore Matthew Perry and American warships helped open Japan to trade with the United States and other nations in the 1850s, and in the years that followed, Japan took major steps toward becoming a modern industrial nation. By the 1920s and 30s, Japan was industrializing, but it lacked oil, rubber, and other natural resources of its own. For this reason, Japanese political leaders looked with envy at the Dutch, French, and British colonies across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and Japanese business leaders saw huge markets for their products in nearby countries like Korea and China. Japan's desire to use East Asia to gain natural resources and sell manufactured products was in direct conflict with American plans for Asia. This was especially true concerning China. Washington created an open-door policy toward China. It wanted to keep China's natural resources and markets free from control by Japan or any other nation. For this reason, Americans were very concerned when Japanese forces invaded the Manchuria area of China in 1931. The United States was also very concerned about protecting its imports of oil, tin, and rubber from Southeast Asia. This area of the world was a major supplier of these resources in the 1930s. The Middle East had not yet become a leading producer of oil. In these ways, the United States and Japan were competing for the same resources and Asian markets. However, there also was a good deal of trade between the two nations. In fact, Japan depended on the United States for most of its metal, copper, and oil. This trade with Tokyo became a major concern for President Franklin Roosevelt in 1937 with the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War, what some considered to be the beginning of World War II itself. In summer of that year, more Japanese troops moved into China. They quickly captured much of the Chinese coast. Much of the metal, oil, and other materials that Japan used for its war effort in China came from the United States. Americans did not like selling Japan materials to use against China, but the trade was legal because of a 1911 agreement between Tokyo and Washington. However, the American government told Japan in 1939 that it would end the earlier agreement. It would no longer sell Japan materials that could be used for war. This, combined with the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, caused Japan to temporarily halt its expansion. At least until Hitler's successes in Western Europe. Extremists in the Japanese government saw the German victory as their chance to launch their own attack on European colonies in Asia. They quickly began negotiations with Hitler to form a new alliance, and within months, militant leaders overthrew the moderate government in Tokyo. The new Japanese government was headed by a moderate, Prince Kanoye, but the Minister of War was an expansionist, General Tojo. Tokyo wasted no time in taking action. It forced France to give Japan permission to occupy northern Indochina. And Tokyo also demanded that Britain close the Burma Road to the Chinese city, then known as Chungking. The Burma Road was a major route by which the United States was supplying China with munitions as part of the Lend-Lease Act. In the second half of 1940, President Roosevelt banned the export of metal and oil products to Japan. His administration also lent money to China. America began to supply Chiang Kai-shek's government with a fleet of P-40 fighter airplanes with volunteer pilots, led by Army aviator Claire Chennault, to train Chinese pilots. The squadron became known as the Flying Tigers. American representatives quietly began to meet with British and Dutch officials to discuss joint defense plans for possible Japanese attacks in the Western Pacific. Washington and Tokyo held long negotiations in 1941. With the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Japanese troops were free to invade southern Indochina. President Roosevelt reacted to Japan's invasion of Indochina by taking three major steps. First, he took control of all Japanese money in the United States. Second, he brought the armed forces of the Philippines under American command. Third, he closed the Panama Canal to Japanese shipping. In August, the U.S. and British governments warned Japan not to invade Thailand. Once again, a conflict developed between moderates and extremists in the Japanese government. Prime Minister Konoye urged one more effort to reach an agreement with the United States, but the Japanese Army and Navy believed that the time had come to go to war to end American and European power in East Asia forever. Negotiations between Japan and the United States continued through the final months of 1941, but the two nations were on the edge of war. They were as close to hostilities as Washington was with the Nazi government in Berlin. American military officials captured secret messages from Japan during this time. They learned that Tokyo was planning an attack of some kind unless the United States suddenly changed its policies. However, the American officials could not discover exactly where or how the attack would be made. Almost everyone in Washington expected the Japanese would attack south of Japan. They were wrong. Thanks for watching this first video in this series on Operation Torch. Next time we'll cover events following Pearl Harbor and the evolution of the planning for Operation Torch. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.